Okay, well, what an amazing gathering. Good morning, friends. Paul and Brian have asked me if I would say just a few introductory words on behalf of all three of us, co-authors behind today's book. We've been writing together for many years. The first book, written with others, A Call to Mind, published in 1981, almost 40 years ago, soon followed by Bound to Love in 1985. Throughout these 40 years, there's rarely been a time when we've not been working on a text for publication. And usually the word covenant has not been far below the surface. For the last 10 years, we have met every few months, working first on Baptist and the Communion of Saints, and then community, covenant, and creativity. We meet, we yarn, we eat together, and every time we chew over a draft text of one or another of us has prepared, anticipating our next book. Each chapter goes through multiple versions and eventually, with a great deal of input from Paul, goes to a publisher. For my part, and I'm fairly confident I speak for all three, our experience of working together and the friendship that has developed has not merely brought significant joy, but certainly for me, has sustained the momentum for my own continuing theological and spiritual formation. I can't now remember quite how the Communion of Saints arrived on our agenda, but it has sustained us for more than a decade, and today it becomes our special focus. So enough of that. My contribution, called On Hiddenness and Disclosure. Concepts of hiddenness and disclosure take us right to the heart of my own contribution to our book. Also keep us near my three much favoured categories: connectedness, memory, and strangeness. My personal pleasure in the visual arts has been sustained by a consistent experience that reflection on pictures is a reliable source of insights that otherwise would remain hidden. I soon learnt that it did not matter very much whether an artist has a religious affiliation. Indeed, the skepticism of many artists about all things religious can clear cluttered ground and enables them to communicate spiritual depth, free from the distraction of too much formal religion. Artists, I find, are among those who are able to disclose spiritual realities that would otherwise remain hidden. I contributed 3 chapters, one inspired by the landscape paintings of Paul Nash, one by the canvases of Mark Rothko, and one that takes up the theme of hiddenness itself. Nash and Rothko have been favourites for many years. Both played a major part in developing my own appreciation of painters and paintings. Nash shows little or no interest in formal religion, but I've always found his paintings, especially his landscapes, pregnant with spiritual sensitivity and insight. His flirtations with surrealism, symbolism, and other contemporary movements in art have provided fertile starting points for serious spiritual reflection. It would be easy to stereotype Rothko as simply anti-religious, but evidence suggests that his murals provide an excellent focus for meditation and contemplative prayer. One of Rothko's major achievements, something in which he took great pride, was his work on large canvases for a multi-faith chapel in Houston, Texas. People tell me that there is a spiritual intensity in the Houston chapel, which would be hard to achieve for someone not genuinely alive to spiritual realities. Back to Nash then. I'm going to read a passage from Nash's autobiography, recalling a childhood memory. I'm quoting from my own chapter, and I'm going to include my reflections on Nash's words. Nash wrote, "There are places, just as there are people and objects and works of art, whose relationship of parts creates a mystery, an enchantment which cannot be analysed. This place of mine," says Nash, a childhood memory of the round pond in Kensington Gardens, "was not remarkable for any unusual features that stood out. Yet there was a peculiar spacing in the disposal of the trees, or it was their height in relation to those intervals, which suggested some inner design of very subtle purpose." He goes on, "As I grew up and discovered new places, and later began to record them in drawings and paintings, it was always the inner life of the subject, rather than its characteristic lineaments, which appealed to me, though that life, of course, is inseparable actually from its physical features. So that the secret of a place lies there for everyone to find, though not perhaps to understand." So I then wrote, "That is right. Many people do see it and maybe even feel it, at least in part, but few are able to make adequate use of it in their quest to plumb the meanings of a human life." I go on to use this idea that there can be hidden realities in a place and in good paintings of it, whatever that might mean. Sometimes one of the hiddens can be expressions of human community, particularly communities that have stamped their indelible mark on the history of a particular place. Sometimes then in a painting, I find myself becoming part of just such a hidden community. And I've worked with that idea as a way into the communion of saints. Perhaps you can also see in this extract why Nash is a useful conversation partner in one of the seminal themes in our book: our determination to do theology without recourse to uncritical dualisms. In my chapter on Nash, I make particular use of the work of Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Merleau-Ponty helps me to develop a link between Nash's fascination for places and the broader idea of connectedness. Places disclose Nash's own deep experience of connectedness with everything around him. Here's another quotation from my chapter. Merleau-Ponty can help us as we think further about the theme of connectedness. Quote, We are mixed up with the world and with others in an inextricable confusion, he wrote, highlighting ways in which the viewer and the viewed cannot be artificially separated from each other. This we know for certain, we are in this together. Merleau-Ponty wrote, rationality is not a problem. There is no unknown behind it that we would have to determine deductively or prove inductively beginning from it. We witness at each moment this marvel that is the connection of experiences. And no one knows how it is accomplished better than we do, since we are this very knot of relations. My comment was, I like his confidence in the power and trustworthiness of human perception. We do this well, he suggests, because we are this very knot of relations. There is such an extraordinary level of connectedness between human persons and the entirety of the given universe. I find that Nash's paintings enable me to get inside this connectedness between human persons and the entirety of the universe, which again is why I can draw on them to explore the communion of saints. Turning to Mark Rothko. If Nash finds his inspiration in place, Rothko finds his inspiration in space, the space of enormous canvases. I never cease to be fascinated by the passion that an empty space can arouse amongst Rothko's critics. Quoting my chapter again. Humans, it seems, are easily alarmed by space and also by the silence which can accompany it. It signals too blatantly, as Rothko repeatedly comments, intimations of mortality. It confronts us with death, itself often the occasion for conspiracies of silence. It's tempting to connect this sense of alarm around space and silence, fear perhaps, with an unusual event that took place on the 7th of October 2012 at the Tate Modern in London. Was it significant that in a rare and extreme breach of security, black on maroon mural number 6 in the Rothko room was deliberately vandalized and sustained costly damage? The investigation that followed into the motivation for this attack revealed complex motives, but remains inconclusive. I am struck by the idea that such a superficially inoffensive painting should draw such acute attention, violence even. Is there something about the empty but not empty space, the apparently nothing, that cries out and intimidates and causes offense? Similar to the way that I brought Nash into conversation with Merleau-Ponty, I bring Rothko into conversation with Jean-Paul Sartre. I've long been drawn to Sartre's exploration of the hidden power of nothingness, ever since I read La Nausée as a rather depressed undergraduate in the 1970s. In the book I write, There is a fascinating passage in Sartre's Being and Nothingness, where he invites his readers to accompany him on a visit to his local cafe in Paris. I can easily imagine him engaged in refined intellectual conversation with his Parisian friends. On arrival in the cafe, Sartre finds that his friend, Pierre, whom he expects to meet there, is nowhere to be seen. He then proceeds to explore just how deeply significant the absence of his friend really is. Indeed, how his absence, in its own strange way, actually makes his friend thoroughly present. The absence of his friend influences his feelings, his activities, in fact, his whole life very deeply. Analysing this experience as Sartre does can help us to understand why some minimal experiences, apparently of nothing, a seeming absence, might in fact become a very significant way by which we come to recognise a less obvious but no less real presence. In our book, I have been able to use Sartre's narrative to explore various ways in which a Rothko-style absence can become a portal leading us further in, below and beyond the surface level. Looking at a Rothko in a gallery, perhaps standing with others, it's easy to imagine ourselves drawn together through such a portal, discovering on the other side, surprisingly, that we have arrived with others too, carried on the waves of imagination. Maybe people who've been especially significant in our own lives. We can actually find ourselves in company with a whole crowd of companions. In this way, I've been able to connect an experience of looking at paintings with the Christian idea of the communion of saints. It was only in the third and final contribution to our book that I looked specifically at the idea of hiddenness. In conversation with Paul and Brian, I began to understand why it is so important for us to make a clear distinction between absence and hiddenness, especially when talking about God. So I wrote, absence of God, that is a very stark word indeed, but it's not difficult to understand why some writers feel the need to use it. In so many ways, it matches very well the extreme severity of the human experiences that have prompted it. Earlier, I began to make a distinction between an experience of feeling of absence and an ontological truth concerning hiddenness. And it's to that distinction I turn. Using the term absence assumes a massive prior judgment about what it means for God to exist. A judgment, I would argue, that remains beyond our intrinsic human limitation. Most theologians would agree that a final answer to a question about God's existence or non-existence is simply not in our gift. Faith or trust in God is a step that we reasonably take on the basis of our ability, credibly, to imagine God's existence And any claim to determine God's absence will inevitably be subject to the same limitation too. In choosing the term hiddenness, we are attempting to account for the full force of our experience without making a leap beyond our capability to be certain about ontological realities. Theologically, the case for the term hiddenness is very strong. The possibility of divine absence cannot possibly make sense unless our concept of God enables us to think of God in radical separation from God's world. But if, as we have repeatedly urged in this book, we set our face against this uncritical dualism, instead preferring metaphors and images that center around a concept like participation, then the truth is that God and the world are inseparable. And it is simply impossible to conceive of God as totally absent. The word hiddenness enables us to speak about our human experience without demanding this dualistic division between God and God's world. And also the word mystery, which functions in a similar way. Any exploration of hiddenness would be incomplete without a line or two from R.S. Thomas. This is how I drew him into my chapter. His poem Via Negativa, another well-known label for the apophatic tradition, poet and theologian R.S. Thomas famously wrote about the interstices in our knowledge, the darkness between the stars, as a reliable way to conduct a search for the presence of God. In the majority of his poetic allusions, Thomas clearly favoured the word absence over the less starkly category hiddenness. But there is more than a little ambiguity here. In another poem entitled The Absence, the final line reads, "What resource have I, other than the emptiness without him of my whole being, a vacuum he may not abhor?" This, I suggest, is not absolute absence, but much more like what I've been calling relative absence, such that the vacant emptiness not only takes on the shape of what is in fact primarily hidden rather than absent, and actually has power to project its presence into an apparent void. This then is how I have used visual art to contribute to our controlling theme, the communion of saints. I've wanted to demonstrate how, given the profound interconnectedness of the whole created order, humans included, even pictures that lack human figuration altogether can become expressions of the communion of all people. In the paintings I've selected from both Nash and Rothko, I am able to find traces of those long gone, whose mark is clearly stamped on the world they have left behind, those who continue to make their marks, particularly marks in paint on canvas, And those who in very many different ways, looking at pictures being just one, find they can tap into hidden worlds and find a disclosure of deep interconnectedness, well captured, we have said, in the phrase, the communion of saints. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. If you have a reaction button, you can express your appreciation with the clap symbol at this point, or otherwise by gesturing on the screen. But perhaps now I can hand over to Myra for her response.
Thank you, Christine. Can I just ask, as Richard did, can everybody hear me clearly? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Richard, so much for what you said and for the opportunity to respond to your chapters in this new book. Perhaps because the idea of communion of saints is conceptually very difficult, as you yourself say, quoting Rowan Williams, it pushes us to the edge of words. I am excited by your approach to this subject. I share your conviction, as I guess many do, that visual images can have a unique role, complementing verbal images as we struggle at the boundaries of human understanding. Curiously, your presentation just now has been, I think, there has been a relative absence of the visual, which strikes me as a little bit inconsistent. I've heard a deep conversation with philosophers and poets, which has been, I guess, deeply inspired. Now, I know it has been inspired by those paintings, but I want, if you like, to be as true as I can to your underlying message and invite us all to come to the pictures that you want us to see. Hence, I've asked if pictures can be shown at certain points in this presentation. But to start with, the frustration that some art lovers experience with Rothko's abstract art, for example, is that, as you say very clearly, they feel shortchanged. You yourself felt this way when you first encountered Rothko. Here, these vast, abstract, empty canvases were in your eyesight in first encounter. They were like a waste of space. But patiently, over the years, by constantly returning to them and gazing upon them, you have experienced transformation. Transformation from what seemed like wasted space to sacred space. What at first was hidden to you was slowly being disclosed. Like the art lover who wants the artist to give a bit more because they are uninitiated and confused, I felt a little bit that way when I first read your chapters. I love what you say. I love even more how you say it. You write beautifully. I envy you. But I felt a little shortchanged and a little in need of more help when it comes to making the connections through art with this elusive communion of saints. The initial feeling that I had, however, also changed with time as I returned again and again to your text, and after the conversation we had just a week ago. I recognize, and I certainly welcome the fact that as a process theologian, you will not offer me a tidy, systematic, hermeneutical key to unlocking the mysteries of the communion of saints. Very wise. Rather, working from the premise that the world is an open, constantly unfolding universe, you choose to speak not about the old familiar phrase, life after death, but to tease me with life after life, and to challenge me, the reader, through these artists and their art, to plunge deep into the world as they see it, in order that life beyond what is visible and comprehensible might be to each of us, the viewer, disclosed. So analogous to your encounter with Rothko, I can see that if art is to inform and transform the way I experience the communion of saints, or even more generally, the way I see the world and embrace life beyond life, I need to attend to and engage my whole self with the paintings. Very shortly, we're going to look at Nash's painting. But to give some context, you emphasized and have emphasized in your presentation the importance and specialness of place, and describe how the spirit of a place was something that Nash was conscious of from a very early age, that his childhood memories of enchanted places included copses and gardens where trees dominated the landscape and fired his imagination. These enchanted places filled his memory and imagination and inspired nothing less than a lifetime of art. Trees, to put it shortly, were his passion. No, trees were his obsession. Curiously, I think, as people increasingly disappeared from his landscapes, so the trees populated the landscape, looking often like people. Reminds me a little bit of that story in the Gospels, where Jesus attempted to give sight to a blind man. And he answered in the first instance, "Yes, I can see, but people look like trees walking." I wonder what this connection is between people and trees, or humanity and nature, that is somewhere being tapped here. The powerful impact of Nash's paintings, his landscapes of trees, stems, I think, as you say, from a complex interplay between place, memory, and time. Special places are never lost in the past. They live on in the memory and the imagination. As such, they are a hidden presence which continually influences and shapes how we see and read the world. Nash's perception and interrelationship of place and memory, I believe, helpfully liberates us from binary thought forms which insist on separating and setting in opposition elements that should coexist and interconnect: the past versus the present, absence versus presence. His play with time and place eliminates that barrier. Let's look at the painting, please. Here you see a landscape. It's a rather abstract landscape, but it is still true to him as a landscape artist. So take time, look at it, and absorb it as I read to you. In the painting entitled, "We Are Building a New World," the landscape is totally bleak. It is 1,000,000 miles away from the enchanted places of childhood memory, and must surely be intended, although Richard, you don't, I think, agree with this, must surely have been intended by the artist as deeply ironic. We are building a new world. Submerged in the mud, hidden from sight, is a field of dead soldiers. All that can be seen in the shadowy light are their helmets, and all that is left standing are twisted tree stumps. In earlier paintings of battle scenes, Nash featured signs of nature's resilience, seeming to thrive in spite of the world being at war. But here, the destruction is total. All creation groans in pain. Another deep connection between nature and humanity. While We Are Building a New World is deeply at odds with the bleak landscape that is depicted, there is perhaps a double entendre intended. In the far distant horizon, and you drew my eye to this, Richard, in the far distant horizon, the eye is drawn to the morning sunrise, which slowly pulls out of the shadows this tragic scene of death and destruction. The true nature of war cannot and will not remain hidden. The morning light discloses its ugly truth, and the artist faithfully captures it. Scenes like this, which lived on in Nash's memory, may have contributed to the disappearance of people from his landscapes. But I venture to suggest that the absence or hiddenness of people, coupled with the depiction of trees looking like people populating the landscape, may reflect his desire to replace an anthropomorphic worldview where human domination and violence take center stage with a creation-centered universe. In our eco-sensitive 20th century, communion, covenant-based theology seeks to correct and restore the relationship between humanity and creation. When humanity lives in harmony with creation, when we strive for a safer, cleaner, sustainable world, and when we relate in ways which reflect God's shalom, this is surely a way of participating in life beyond life, communing with all, past, present, and to come. Place in the biblical tradition, just checking my time here, yeah. Place in the biblical tradition is very significant. Events occur in significant places and they become enchanted places. The power of these places live on in generations to come through the collective memory of the community of faith. In the Christian tradition, the upper room is enchanted place. Through memory and imagination, deep connections and levels of meaning have been and continue to be experienced within the ecclesial communion. In this enchanted place, Jesus is unseen, but not absent. His presence is both hidden and revealed in bread and wine. Akin to Nash's emphasis on place and memory, where time is liberated from these rigid separations of past, present, and future, there is a deep interplay between place, memory, and imagination in Eucharistic sharing. Time is dynamic and interconnected. The past lives on in the present as we celebrate in the moment with all who have gone before us and will come after. We turn now to Rothko. In the chapter on Rothko, entitled Telling Little, Revealing Much, you reflect on the Seagram murals, and in particular on the one that I hope will come on the screen now, Mural 6, Black on Maroon. Contemplate, my friends. You suggest, Richard, that a seemingly simple configuration of oil on canvas can speak in remarkably revealing ways. But as I noted earlier, your first reaction to this painting was not quite so positive. Your reaction was an inclination to say that this very provision of space is wasted. But what you now say is it is the very provision of space that has become for you that which you appreciate most in Rothko's work. It is his commitment to space that lastingly calls for our spiritual attention. That picture has helped me, probably for the first time, to look afresh at the picture that now hangs outside of the chapel in Regent's Park College, where I think the title, and Paul might correct me, is There's Too Much Pain in the World. There is a similarity in the genre, but I digress. Rothko's commitment to space in this mural and in the series of these murals extends beyond the murals themselves to a meticulous attention to the space in which they will be exhibited. In the Tate Modern, where they now hang, the precise height above the floor, their relative spacing, the color of the walls for mounting, and the light levels in the room are all carefully tuned to Rothko's prescription. It seems to me, I think we all know it, that curators, art curators and liturgy designers have a great deal in common. They experience that they wish to create is visceral. The overwhelming sensation of vastness and smallness, of transcendence and immanence, is at one and the same time humbling and awe-inspiring. I'm currently living in a rural part of France. It's very remote. It's a place far from the bright lights of towns or cities. The night sky is a vast, dark canvas, which through the darkness, if one contemplates it, reveals myriads of stars. When I sit under the night sky, as I frequently do in these September evenings, I find myself fixed on the Milky Way. This swathe of stars, which I can't fully see, just a blur of white light. But what it discloses to me, even partially, is the center of the galaxy. The sun, our sun, is but one amongst millions of suns in our galaxy. And our galaxy is about one amongst millions of galaxies in the universe. Planet Earth and the sun, whose solar system we are a part of, are very marginal in the galaxy we inhabit. This too is a visceral experience of vastness, which calls for our spiritual attention and surely compels us to make space in our heads to include in our understanding of the communion of the saints, the stars, the planets, the solar systems, and the galaxies that make up this vast, invisible universe. What Nash does with time, Rothko does with space, and his impact is inspiring. The overall effect, maybe not for us initially when we see this, but if we follow your footpath and return again and again, maybe its overall effect will generate an environment in which our minds and spirit are, as they have been for you, freed to journey in ways which rightly deserve the label spiritual. I think my time is more than gone. My last section I can share with you in written form, Christine, if you would like, because I was drawn by another observation you made, Richard, that Rothko has so much in common with iconographers. And I made a list, putting on the one side what you gave me of Rothko's short list of aesthetic beliefs of what makes a good picture. And he conforms religiously to those criteria, alongside the rules and conventions employed by iconographers. And I saw very significant overlap. Both pay particular attention to the way art is an act in itself of self-emptying, self-expression. Rothko, you remind us, distanced himself from the idea that his art was self-expression. His single-minded commitment to his art, his uncompromising commitment to his chosen direction of work, his deep obligation laid upon him as an artist to follow this particular direction is all akin to what theologians, iconographers, and liturgists would want to call vocation. Both emphasize materiality and meticulously describe how a given work must conform to strict conventions and criteria. Both play with perspective, favoring flat forms because they destroy illusion and reveal truth. But perhaps most important of all, the parallel is their understanding of art as a medium. Rothko describes art as an adventure into an unknown world, which can be explored only by those willing to take the risks. Iconography truly does the same. We move into it and beyond it to see what is otherwise hidden. Thank you. I learn from your text, or I deduce, that the communion of saints is possibly a tired metaphor, overly bound and tied down by binary thought forms which insist on separating and making opposing what should coexist and interconnect. I learn from your text that life beyond life, not life after death, better communicates the central important concept. I receive in your exploration of Nash and Rothko illuminating connections with spirituality that begin to liberate me from time and space and help me to commune with the saints, life beyond life, in a context of a vast, open, and constantly evolving universe, one where time and space have no limits. I agree that your art, visual art, can strengthen our confidence in things that we do not see. But I confess in all honesty that I lack strength and confidence of necessity when I think about the communion of saints. Thank you.
Thank you, Myra. Again, much appreciated here, and please show your appreciation accordingly. I'm aware of constraints of time, so I am going to leap straight into the questions now. We've got quite a few that have emerged in the chat function, and I'm going to take them in order. I'm aware that not everyone may therefore get addressed at this point. I may bring in the people that I know are in Australia, because they might not be here in the third session, because the third session is an extended session where we can return to some of the questions that we haven't had time to address. So if you don't get an answer now, please do post your question in the third session where we've got extended discussion time. So first of all, Larry makes an observation about whether the sun is rising or setting in the Nash painting. I wonder whether you both wanted to respond to that one.
Very simply, I do discuss that in the book, and I put my reasons that it's definitely rising.
Right, good. So the answer is buy the book and read it, Larry.
Correct.
So moving on then to question. So Myra, actually, did you agree with the argument?
Well, you know, I think it could work both ways. Because either way, the sun is making its contribution. And it might be more consistent with the title if the sun is actually going down.
Interesting. So interesting disagreement there, but I think that is certainly something that it's worth considering, what the implications are of reading it one way rather than another, in terms of how one reads the painting. Next, a question from Judy Hollier for Richard. Would you like to unmute yourself to ask your question?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you treat it as an observation, I agree. I'm sure it's really important to stay with pictures that you don't like. Absolutely crucial. Which is what I explained with the Rothko when I first saw it. I thought it was, as Myra said, a waste of space. It's only by staying. And I also have got a description in there of sitting in galleries, watching people looking at pictures or not looking at pictures, but just rushing by them. And I know they're full of fantastic depth. If only someone would almost nail them to the spot, and they could spend more time looking.
So is what you're saying that the ones that are worth staying with is anything that causes a reaction? Because the Rothko gets me in my guts. Yeah. The Nash, I just think, well, they're pictures, you know. But I found with things that I needed to look at, icons, it took me a long time to really get into icons. But I did have an initial reaction to them because there were too many people in the Baptist college telling me that they were a work of the anti-pope, antichrist and whatever. And so as an act of perversion, I got into icons, I think. But it took a long time. So how do you know when it's worth persevering? Just
I don't think you can, but I suggest you persevere and find out.
Okay, thank you.
Can I bring in Derek Watson next with his question in the chat? I think we can all read them there about this knot of relations and how creativity and time function in that knot of relations. Richard, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, it's a hard one to read. It looks like really good. Again, more perhaps a statement that I really agree with. In lots of things I write, you know that I find the whole conception of space-time in a Einsteinian and post-Einsteinian way absolutely fascinating, and that it's kind of making our way inside these almost inscrutable knots of reality, that these layers of insight unfold. I might be missing the question. Derek?
Derek, do you want to come back on that? Well, maybe he will come back to us in the later session. But for now, aware of time, I'll move on to, there are two questions here, one from Craig Gardner and one from Lee Greenwood, which are both responding to Myra's contention that liturgists and curators are fulfilling the same function. So Myra, I don't know if you want to come back to both of those together, and then perhaps we can ask Lee and Craig if they want to give a comeback.
I'm trying to find Craig. He's come up several times over here. If artists and liturgists have so much in common, but yet Rothko so carefully curates the space, what might that say to creators of worship? How much control must we give up or retain? How to space and place interconnect in worship? Oh, you've got me on a hobby horse here, Craig. I mean, I think there's been really good writing lately, mostly from pioneering liturgists that have tried to draw this connection between curation and liturgy design. And that has opened the door, I think, in the Baptist world to a much deeper reflection on the interconnection and the vital, visceral nature of worship, that if it is curated well, is a much more full expression of worship as art. We dumb it down when we don't try to imagine the space and imagine the place as speaking even before we've got in there. So I think as Baptists, we've got a long way to go, but as Baptists, we've got a lot of freedom and the possibility to curate enormously interesting spaces that are not dictated by old doctrinal dogmatic statements is our opportunity.
And then could you also perhaps come back to or comment on the question from Lee Greenwood, which is, how do we make sure that this does not lead to an overemphasis on the aesthetic or performative in liturgy?
That's a matter of taste, I think. What is excessive to one person is absent to others. And that's why we go to different churches for the most part these days. We go to that place where we feel we have found an engagement, not just with words, but with the total environment. And that's the people in it and everything about it, the visual, the music, the lot. So I think that my answer is not going to be very satisfactory, because I don't think that there is for everybody equally an excess or an absence. It is purely a matter of taste.
And then a question now for Richard from Paul Weller. Quite a big question here. Interesting to hear your
I've read it. I just totally agree with Paul about everything. No, my part doesn't make an enormous number of connections to Baptists, but my colleagues will do, I think, more and more as the day goes by. I'm enormously happy with the idea that this is of significance to all Christians, and indeed all people, simply by being human. Why did we get onto it as Baptists? I suppose because historically it's been a neglected thing. I think some of our assumptions about dualism have made us feel this isn't to do with us, and we'll leave that to Catholics and Orthodox and other. And I think what we're saying is, no, if you probe in this kind of way, there are themes here that Baptists should enjoy as well.
Paul, did you want to come back there?
No, I think that's fine, at least for now. I'm sure the theme might come back again.
Yeah, I'm
later
sure
in the
that will
day.
come up later in the discussion and after the third session, so perhaps you could contribute then. We've got time for just one last question from Ashley Lovett, who writes that Ashley's intrigued by the idea that space can highlight the absence of others, and I wonder if the new configurations of our places of worship with spaces to keep people apart, socially distanced, might also be used to help people recognise the presence of those who aren't or cannot be with us because of constraints imposed by health and so on. I wonder if you wanted to reply to that comment.
That has to be a Myra.
I think it evokes lots of reflections. The way we will gather physically will evoke lots of reflections, and I do believe will create a bond with those that are absent that maybe didn't exist before. I certainly have found with online worship, as we have Sunday by Sunday, there is a new bond of fellowship happening that many of us said didn't exist when we're physically in the same space. We've suddenly been attending to one another in a way that we didn't when it was just too easy to walk past each other. So I think social distancing has lots of evocative bits about it. On another occasion, I mentioned how I found myself equating social distance with the necessity of the hiddenness of God. If God comes too close all of the time, we will have no space to work out our own direction in the way that partnership requires. To be truly and fully made in the way God made us, we need space to get it wrong as well as right. And so God does us a favor by staying hidden.
Thank you.
Can I just...
Yeah, sure, Richard.
Chrissy, as a last comment, because I know you're going to draw this to a close. I mean, I'm just thrilled by Myra's response to this. I had about 5 years to write these chapters, and she's made this stunning response to it in a few weeks, and it takes it a great distance further. Wonderful, Myra. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard.
Well, yeah, I think we would all like to echo heartfelt thanks to both of you for giving us such a brilliant insight into what a powerful contribution this book makes to our thinking in such a wide variety of ways. And so thank you on behalf of everyone here to both Richard and to Myra. And please, if you didn't get a chance to express your questions now, do please jot those down. I know there's one that's just come in from Martin Hobgon, so if you don't mind, we'll carry that over to the third session where there's further conversation time. And I also had some questions which I'll save to ask till later, but we are aware that we've advertised to give you some time away from the screens, and so I will draw to a close now this formal first session and invite you all to rejoin us again at 2:15. The meeting link is for 2 o'clock, just so that the waiting room will be open then, but we'll start at 2:15 for the next session with Paul Fiddes and Elizabeth Newman. So we look forward to you all joining us then. But thanks again to Myra and to Richard for this really stimulating discussion.
Yes.
Great.